I suppose CEF have a lot of material that we could have chosen from today. So it's probably we're trying to squeeze the guys into a shorter time than they're probably used to. So we've picked a certain few modules. There's a whole raft of other modules that would be of benefit to some people from different perspectives. So I suppose on one level, I apologize. Some of the terminology you may have heard during the presentations, we may not have explained it at this point in the day. In the second half, we'll elaborate on things like PEPAL, access points and things like that. But I really wanted to give you a sense of, I suppose, what's possible from e-invoicing, and so hearing about the early adopters, and then the user's perspective that Martin's just gone through. Again, I suppose Martin alluded to it there, that all the steps that were laid out in front of us aren't necessarily steps that we will have to take ownership of. But I think it's important to see all the steps so you can position yourself within the end-to-end flow and say, well, that's the bit I really need to care about, or that's the bit that's going to be taken care of for me by another party. So I think it was, well, personally, I think it was excellent, both of you. So I don't know how we're doing on time. We did want to have a few questions. We still got time for that, Jess. So maybe Christian, would you mind joining us up here? And Martin, would you take a seat, please? Just on what we've just heard, I suppose, things that I struck me were, I think it seems like obviously it's been a long road for the early adopters, and what we see now perhaps hides a lot of the sweat and hard work that's gone in to get to the point where you're in a position to be able to just mandate it now and go to a full 100%. And that, as it was mentioned, incurs costs for the early adopters that hopefully countries like Ireland can now build on and reuse the lessons learned and the infrastructure and standards that are in place that will reduce that time frame to take us to the next step and the cost that we'll have to incur to adopt e-invoicing on a broader scale. We heard about mere image files not being compliant with the standard, and I suppose scans of PDFs and things like that. And that is the directive as it is. It defines e-invoicing in a very specific way. It's trying to push automated processing as much as possible. But I would note that where there's an e-invoicing system in place and it's serving the community of suppliers that it's there to serve and it's functioning well, the directive is not asking for those solutions to be pushed aside or not be encouraged. So the directive is there to encourage structured system, but to live and live with or perhaps enhance existing systems to support the new standard. So if something's working, it's not about throwing it out and starting again. It's saying, great, if you're processing stuff electronically, it's working for you. Keep up the good work. But there is now this obligation to have another channel that supports the standard. And hopefully over time, I suppose, things will converge into a common enough stream. On the CEF funding, I know there's a couple of interested parties in the room about that. So I hope you weren't dodging bad news for Ireland in terms of the results. And we'll hear the results in a couple of weeks. But I would encourage everybody to look at the CEF online resources. This really is an absolute wealth of information about e-invoicing at all levels on there. And it's open, it's free. You can register and get deeper into the website, but you don't have to register. Get onto the website and see there's videos, there's training sessions, there's validation tools for anybody who's working with the standard already. And then the guys mentioned additional training services. So please feel free to contact them directly, but if anybody is interested, we're more than happy to work with anybody and help coordinate that. If anyone has a particular need that they might want to home in on a particular area and use the facilities of CEF. So, okay, with that then we'll go into our questions and answers, okay.
Yes?
Hi. Trevor, sorry, I'm waiting for a mic for you.
Good morning, Martin, and good morning, Kristen. Really, really interesting presentation this morning. Thanks so much. My name is Trevor Curley. I'm the Purchase to Pay Workstream Manager on behalf of the Civil Service implementation of Oracle R12 e-Business Suite. You mentioned, Martin specifically mentioned the customer-provided web portal. Within Oracle, we're implementing a supplier portal. Is that a valid method In other words, is that compliant with the directive to receive e-invoices? You're not taking it in the usual prescribed format. What effectively what the supplier will be doing is flipping the purchase order into an invoice and submitting it electronically from the web portal in behind the firewall and into the payables module of Oracle. Is that compliant or not compliant?
I would say that it's a very common way of doing it. It's when it comes to compliance to the directive, if it's the only way, I would say it's if the public entity requires or relies only on that channel, I would say that they're probably not reliant on the compliant to the directive, because they will not then be able to receive invoicing following the standard. But it's a very good additional functionality to provide for your suppliers, for those who cannot create their invoices in their own. So for small companies, for example. So I would say that if it was a single channel approach, then I wouldn't call that compliant with the directive.
Okay, if I could ask a second question, thank you very much for that. As Declan knows, we are working very closely with the standards that have been published by the EU, and our service provider is doing all the technical build to allow us to process and map to Oracle fields, etc., etc. We're somewhat constrained at the moment that we don't have a service provider, and as Declan alluded to earlier on, it's going to be sometime later this year when we do. So in the interim, we've had to use test files available from from the EU in terms of what we've done is we've kind of created, we've put those test files, dropped those test files into a location, and then we're kind of interacting with that location to process the test invoice. In your experience of service providers, do you see it as a service where they would actually drop files into a location, or is the expectation and your experience ERP solutions such as Oracle going out and connecting and taking from the service provider and the gateway, for want of a better word?
I think most service providers in Peppol have several options on how to integrate the last mile. That's sometimes called the last mile to the ERP system, in Oracle in your case. Either that they provide a pickup folder, so you'll download from the access point, or they hand it over to Oracle. There are also more advanced approaches where you can collect it through some API. And so depending on the service provider, I think there are several options. But what you refer to as picking up from a folder and then just importing them, that is a normal approach.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, Michael Morgan from the Department of Education and Skills. We are an access point that I'll be speaking later. But one of the things that, from my experience, is that even though the PDF is not not a solution, an e-invoice, there's a lot of expectation in the system to have a PDF somewhere, and that's been our experience. Is there a proposed method of doing similar to basically has been done in XBRL to do an iXBRL, to move to a rendered solution that is quite neat, to move the e-invoice to a rendered solution that can be interacted with by human interaction, even though the processing is happening in the background, and that's all good. But having that PDF, or at least having a link to a PDF from the supplier somewhere in the system, and we've done that for a lot of our invoices, that really is something that helps the transition to the system. Any thoughts on that, please?
Peppol is providing a presentation style sheet for the invoices according to the new standard. So when receiving the document, the receiver can easily create a visual presentation of the invoice, or generate a PDF according to that presentation. which then is used in the workflow. So when you're looking at the invoice, that's how it's being presented. That means that all invoices will have the same look and feel. So invoices from your telephone company or from your energy company, they will have the same layout. And this is, for some people, this has been like in the beginning, they used to see the logo, they used to see, but after seeing eInvoicing being used, eInvoicing being used for a few years now in Sweden, most receivers actually like that in the end. In the beginning, it's a bit awkward, but all invoices look exactly the same and you don't see the logos. But in the end, it's very easy to assess an invoice because they always look the same. You rather looking at the content of the invoice than the layout of the invoice, so to speak. So that is what Peppol is providing. It's a standardized presentation style sheet. It's not mandatory. A ERP system can very well create a better one or a more user-friendly one, whatever. But there is one that is available. iXBRL, if I understand it correctly, carries already from the beginning the presentation logic inside the file. So what the issuer sees on the invoice is exactly what the receiver will see. This in the e-invoicing context, that only happens when the issuer has the same style sheet as the receiver has. Then they see exactly the same thing, but there's no guarantee. So, but I think from my personal experience, this has not been seen as a big challenge when getting more and more electronic invoices, because the standardized presentation is it's more convenient than awkward.
And within the standard, does it support the transmission of a supporting document, perhaps in PDF format within, so a delivery reference or something?
The standard allows for adding attachments, but it has been debated heavily whether a copy of the invoice to the invoice is a good thing. And in Peppol, the conclusion is that it's not a good thing because you will receive two invoices. One is what being the PDF from the supplier, and the other is the structure format, which is the kind of the official one. But what happens if this differs? Often the PDF might have some fixed values in the end, perhaps some legal terms. It might have some additional data that's not necessarily in the electronic invoice. And which one are you as a receiver required to make sure that they are always equal? Or do you need to archive both? And there's a lot of questions that comes up if you're receiving two invoices with the same invoice numbers. But yeah, so therefore it says in the implementation that an attached copy of the invoice is not compliant to the standard.
I have a couple of questions because we've received some questions in from people who've sent queries on attendance, so just might have time for a couple. Yeah. In terms of, are you aware of any legal obstacles encountered when countries initially introduced e-invoicing? So in terms of, I suppose, whether their electronic invoicing are acceptable to national and European auditors, how have countries authenticated an invoice as being from a particular party? Is it digital signatures? What? Any challenges in that area?
The new standard, it was very ambitious. I will talk about it after the coffee.
Okay.
To have one simple standard that takes care of all e-invoicing in Europe is very, very ambitious, even we would say somewhat naive request. There are some ways in the standard to enforce domestic rules. But I will slightly touch on that.
Okay.
But some countries have some peculiar requirements. on information that must be provided on the invoice. We have some extra elements in Sweden. For example, we need to the supplier needs to clearly state that he's paying salary taxes or income tax to, and we have also need to provide the city of where the board is registered of the company. So, and most countries have these small things that are not perhaps from the VAT directive. They come from other types of legal rooms, and but the standard is pretty flexible. So we found ways of handling that without any modifications of the standards. We are just using the European standard without, other than we have some guidance. So
Okay.
this is how you do it. So.
We'll talk about PEPL in the afternoon a bit more, but I think when we augment implementing the standard with PEPL, my understanding of that brings a level of digital authentication to the transmission of these, so you can, with the use of digital certificates, enables you to verify that it came from a trusted or the intended party.
The question of signing invoices have come up many times, but I often counter the worry is that how can I trust an invoice if it's not signed? And then I would say, do you trust an invoice which is signed? Who would be the first ones to sign their invoices? Because those who are sending fake invoices are not normally hiding who they are, because they want to get the payment. It's just that they have a very fishy business model. But that doesn't preclude them from having be able to sign the invoices. So normally it's the problem that you have, you haven't purchased what's in the invoice, or you have purchased but you didn't understand the full, yeah. So, but within PEPL, this is partly taken care of. Is that every invoice, if you're sending an invoice in PEPL, you have to have some kind of contract with a PEPL access point or your system which you enter your invoice in. And in that contract there are some required legal things that the access point need to know who you are, somehow authenticate you.
Okay, we'll touch on that a bit more. Question here, sorry Christian. Yeah.
We do know that some countries are requesting this feature to be developed. So there's nothing really in the e-delivery components or the components from the Commission preventing signing of e-invoices. It's more about the interoperability aspects. So Poland, for instance, Italy, Greece, they would very much like to have signing of e-invoices, but from a historical point of view, it hasn't been needed. So let's see. The European Multi-Stakeholder Forum for e-invoicing, it was part of the original scope for the new mandate, whether or not they should look into this, especially on the business-to-business or business-to-consumer invoicing. There it could also be needed with some kind of signing, but I think it's a future step.
It's definitely
so. It seems sufficient. So Mark, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Mark Warren here in the Office of the Government CIO. Excuse my ignorance, I might know the most about e-invoicing, but my question is about that kind of identification piece of the businesses. In terms of actually identifying yourself to that access point, how onerous is that for the business? Especially for small businesses, you know, is it certificates? Is it just logging in with a VAT number or something, or is it something a bit more complicated? In terms of how those small businesses will also interact with it, is there going to be any assistance given? I think central portals were kind of mentioned as a way to kind of identify the business and be able to supply. So for, let's say, sole traders or something, would there be a central place where they can go and engage with the whole public sector in terms of just issuing invoices to public sector bodies?
I think it depends a lot about the size of the business that are going to be connected. Because we can also see, if we look into the general overview of the infrastructure, the four-corner model that Martin was trying to describe. Sorry. You were missing a slide, I noticed. Well, the four-corner model that Martin was describing is that there are a governance framework that take care of once a business is connected to a service provider, that service provider is also vouchering for let's say, legal status or the mutual trust with the business. So that for small businesses, it could be beneficial to have a service provider that offers this kind of portal solution. Medium-sized businesses, they might have an ERP solution which is integrated up against the service provider, whereas the big, larger companies will probably have their own solution or their own access points. So in general terms, we don't see that many small businesses having their own access points. They would rather be hooked up on a service provider or some kind of portal solution, infrastructural service provider.
In Peppol specifically, it is a rather relaxed approach, if that's the proper word, on the user authentication. The access point or the service provider, he has to, as I mentioned, have some kind of authentication in place. But it doesn't say necessarily that you have to use your eID. That he has to have some way of authenticating and follow up on.
So it could just be a simple form online to ask what's your business name, what's your business.
Essentially, yes. And the reason why it's okay to be rather relaxed in this sense is that the invoice, if you have, as a receiver, if you just pay all invoices that you receive, you have big problems. You need to make sure that you actually did the purchase, that it was approved, and that the goods were received, and that the account numbers have been previously registered in your accounting system, and that the supplier is a contracted supplier, perhaps. So you have many measures that takes care of any fake invoice in that sense. And if there would be a fake invoice, there are still a good traceability. The problem to have super high authentication requirements on the supplier side is that it just makes it so complicated. We have hundreds of thousands of companies that now will have to send invoices and to require specific eID solutions for that. And whose eID? Should it be the CEOs or the someone who represent the company? Most eID solutions around Europe doesn't have that type of information. So you can authenticate someone as a private person, but you don't know if he's allowed to represent a specific company. And so it's so complicated, all that area. So for now, it's important to have these business controls as a receiver. I think would be my takeaway.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Just you touched on this slightly in your presentation, but I got the sense that suppliers and SMEs in general are broadly welcoming e-invoicing. There's not a huge resistance, or it's not seen as a cost burden. Is that fair to say in the experience?
That's definitely my experience. That for the small, as in Sweden, normally we have like portals. We have companies like Pagero and InExchange and B2B Router, and there's a handful of these which are very, very cheap, or even in some case free, to use for small suppliers. Perhaps you can send up to 3 invoices a month for free, and then you have to pay a few euros a month or something. So it's a fierce competition on providing those type, because they have additional services, like if you want to also have e-procurement, then it costs some extra, and so on. So e-invoicing becomes a step into their solution. So I think for the small companies, it's not that problematic, because they can live with these type of portal systems. It's more it's harder for the medium size, sometimes with their own ERP systems, or very old, or they have made so many customizations over the year, and then they have to upgrade it so it can create these invoices. Those have more of a challenge. But on the other hand, they are bigger and more financially capable.
Make their case for it, yeah.
Also, naturally, we hear from, we've been talking about these islands of procurement, islands of e-invoicing, and we also, sometimes we meet people that would prefer to stay on the island because they have a solid business case there. It could be the case for some service providers, and it can also be the case for some very large suppliers. For instance, in retail, we often stumble across it where they don't have an sentiment or interest in changing from whatever they had, 80FACT or God knows what, over to new standards. And of course, this is where the interoperability aspect comes into place from our side, is that we try to address interoperability across Europe on many different levels. So as Martin says, it depends a lot about on the situation of those sending and receiving. Where are they? What's the size and volume? And also the legacy of their current systems, because it can be costly to change.
Okay, thank you.